I'm really curious. What did it feel like to be in the position of the person who was being interviewed, as opposed to interviewing, which is what typically you all do as journalists? Did anybody have any interesting experiences being on the other side?
Did you feel vulnerable? Were there questions you couldn't really or readily answer? Did you feel uncomfortable? Yeah, I remember listening in on yours. That was, yeah, so how many people were laughing at the baby? Yeah.
Tell us about your experience. It sounds like you were being cross-examined, you said?
It was insinuated that I was the one who killed my child.
Yes.
So it was very
It was uncomfortable. Right. Yeah.
Hard
And that was the
and did you
insinuator.
find that effective in getting answers
Yeah,
beyond?
I worked my way into it. Like I made it seem like I was like, oh, tell me about your medical career, your
And he
pharmaceutical
just dropped
career.
it.
Oh, so you were being manipulative.
Kind of, yeah.
And so based on that way of interrogating her, what was the story then that she would write based upon her answers?
She was not responding at all. She was laughing too hard.
Okay.
But were you able to get anything out of the interview?
Oh,
that
yeah.
You could, what did you get?
I got that.
So what is your story? What's the headline of your story?
Question, I would say, death of child, murder, question mark.
Okay.
So like, it's like, did, like a typical, not like a typical, because that's not really a typical thing, but
Right.
like a questioning, like I'm not saying it happened, but I'm saying it, not saying it didn't happen either, you know, like I'm leaving, it's like a little open-ended thing.
Well, but that's a little tricky because legal can get involved, right? Because if you say murder, I mean, if she has not been charged with a crime, you can't,
She's under investigation though.
What?
She's under investigation.
Now, if she's under investigation, we can say that she's under investigation. But yeah. I mean,
Well,
the
and
murder-
also, can you feel confident from a 5-minute interview that is a conclusion you can draw?
I
Because
just
that's a big
assumed it went
accusation to
longer,
make.
And the 5 minutes were just like the clip that we did.
Okay.
I was digging into it. I really went in.
You did some research coming
Right.
in. Okay.
Okay, that's important.
All right. And what was anybody experience being on the other side of that questioning? How did that make you feel? Tell me about your experience.
Me?
Uh-huh.
As a mother, I felt like I wanted to give information, but I also wanted to be grieving to kind of make it difficult for the interviewer to kind of how to tactfully ask me questions about the death of my child.
So you were so you wanted a certain type of question to be asked, right?
Yeah.
So what about the interviewers? Did you find it difficult to interview depending on the subject? Who found it difficult, to come up with questions? You did, why was it difficult?
The response was very short.
Okay.
And then they would just say no or yes or no, and then we would try.
How would you try?
Ask them to explain or ask it in a different
way?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, I kind of tried to make up evidence of things people were doing that might have surprised the.
Which one did you have?
We were
the politician?
the politicians. I was
Okay.
interviewing the politicians, so things like I was like, well, there's this petition to reverse it, or this one really popular bar is going to shut down because their main business is from 12 to 2 a.m. So that kind of was able to lead to more things that were, instead of just saying a no or a talking around the question, more of we can't comment on this, or to kind of confuse and scare the interviewee kind of a bit more to based on fact, but
Right, and clearly when we're in these situations, we're not making anything up. We would
Well,
we would have done the research,
did
right,
research,
yeah, so that we are prepared to ask to dig deeper, right? Anybody else who yes, I'm sorry.
Mine was the politician one. My partner, she made it where she was not the sole person that voted. She was always well, it was a group of us. I spoke for the people.
Right.
So not really owning up. So it was hard for me to ask questions because it was always oh, it wasn't just me. It was my group. It was all of us, government people. It was the people writing letters to me about this stuff. So
Did you say who? Could you say, give me specifically who, so it wasn't just you, but who else was involved?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of, because people will do that a lot, and they'll say that, oh, it wasn't just me, but it's kind of no, push it, I'll defer.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that that's a real life example, and you have to be aware of, that's where your research is really important, because they, that's really interesting, but you voted X, Y, and Z times on all these others, so what responsibility do you take? Sure, it's a group effort, but you're also, an individual. What responsibility do you take? So that's where research and just knowing your stuff really cuts through the crap. One other question I was going to ask you, as a grieving mother, you said you were concerned about the questions that were asked. How would you, being in that position, ask questions differently with a sensitivity maybe that you were looking for?
I thought my partner did a good job of asking me questions about like how would you help other parents and beginning I'm sorry for your loss, and acknowledging that pain. I think that was important.
Is there anything else people gained in terms of, what did you learn? Can you talk a little bit about what you learned in your experience kind of being on both sides?
Sure, okay. So I was the grieving mother and I was, being interviewed. I thought that my partner generally did an excellent job of being sensitive in the questions he asked. He asked questions that I think would have made any mother feel proud of her children. And I did start, it definitely made me want to respond because he asked me questions about, for example, some of my daughter's interests and some of the things that made me happy. And so I would definitely want to talk about those. I thought my partner did a great job of doing that.
Okay.
Did anybody kind of say no comment, or I just can't, or did anybody say I really don't want to talk right now, or I can't? Because that, you will, as I'm certain you probably already know, as some of you know, that somebody, it's okay when people say, I just can't talk. And then maybe you can hand a card or something, say if you do want to talk, if you want your story told, your child's story told, please call me. And it's also really important to have a track record so that people know that you're someone who's respectful of the story and accurate, and that you're going to tell it in a way that and we're not there for anybody to be used by anybody, but to tell a story that enhances and informs. So should we give the tips?
Right, so you guys, great job.
Yeah.
Hand for you. It's a hard thing to just jump into, but we really wanted you to kind of get the idea of, obviously, the art of the interview is really just trying to use your judgment in terms of how you approach different people in different situations at different times, and just be able to start to read people and read situations. That's one of your best assets as a journalist, is an observer, and really just being able to respond to kind of just subtle things, like a person crossing their arms, a person looking down, a person looking away, you know what I mean? To kind of be able to bring out that true emotion, and be, and be upfront and honest. Hey, I'm a journalist, professionally, my credibility works on being the truth, but I can promise I'll be fair, but I need your help to show this other side of the story. And so with that, to leave you, we're going to just give you a few tips that we've come up with together. Obviously, it's not all inclusive, but we just want to kind of things you can think about, and kind of 10 tips that you can be aware of as you're trying to make the interview more of an art than just information, because there really can be a difference. The art of the interview is really about looking for a story and not just asking questions for information. That's the distinction and the difference in which we're trying to offer for you all today. So Dawn, you want to start with?
Sure. We talked about research, and we can't clearly overstate that, and do that before, and then you will come with a set of questions, but don't be afraid to deviate from those questions and let the interview take you to a place.
And if I could just add one thing to that, the research before is to give you a specificity in your questions. So they're not so broad that people can feel like they can get away with a yes or no answer, but it gives them an opportunity to reflect on it and add something different. And that's why I find that, those contrasts, I know I read this about you and your faith and you talking about this, to Jeremy Lin, but tell me about that in the realm of basketball. That's not a typical question, but that's because I've researched it deeply.
And
Sorry
then
about
we
that.
said check everything. I mean, nothing is too small to check. Even if you think, there, in Chicago, there was this kind of bromide that if your mother tells you she loves you, check it out. Check it out.
Especially stats.
Yes. Because people will pull out numbers, and you're like, well, where did those numbers come
Right.
from?
Or studies say,
Yeah.
what study?
Like, what study? Exactly. Clarify what you heard, what you wrote, what you said. I mean, don't feel bad about calling somebody, and we've said this before, over and over. Sometimes people, they may speak a certain way, and you may have to ask them to be a little bit more clear. Sometimes, and I will, depending on the person, I will read a quote back, just to make sure that quote is accurate.
Not politicians or celebrities, but like
more
everyday
everyday
people.
people. Do in-person interviews as much as possible because geography will inform that story. I wrote a story about a woman who had lost 3 of her 4 children to gun violence. And when I walked into her living room, she had a shrine of pictures of these children because she said that there were days when she could not remember what they looked like. So she kept their faces in front. So I think I led the story with that. If not led it, I know that it was pretty high up in the story. So the person's surroundings will definitely tell you as much about him or her as that conversation. Be aware of interviewees playing to the camera or to your notepad or to a recording device, because sometimes people, especially when that red light goes off on the television, all of a sudden they become Barbara Walters or whoever,
They perform.
They perform. Take the time to really know the subject and not just what he or she tells you. And so this may not work on deadline, but especially, there have been many stories where I've gone back multiple times for an interview because initially that first meeting, people kind of tell you what they want you to know. And then as you start to know who they are more and you start to build a relationship, a professional relationship, then they start to open up a little bit more. Report around those who stonewall, and this is what we talked about, where you can get to another source and then go to that original person and then say, well, so-and-so gave me these numbers, and I really want the story to be accurate, and so is this correct? Be persistent in getting a subject to talk or having him or her answer questions. And so that's just, you keep calling, you keep knocking on the door. And even when people say, I'll never talk to you, and I've had situations where they've said that, and then, okay, I'll just tell you one thing, Well, that's the door opening, You get in there for that one thing, and then you ask all of your questions. And don't forget to ask, is there anything else is there anything else you want to say, or is there a question I didn't ask you? Or what else can you tell me that you haven't told somebody else? And
Or
then,
what do you wish I would have asked you?
Yes, absolutely. And I love this. Be professional, be gracious, and grateful because people, especially, and we're not talking about politicians, but
They're humans too, but we're just hard
they
on
are
them.
human, kind of. But really, this is, if you've decided to do this, I'm honored, really, every day that I go in and talk to someone because they've allowed me to come into their space. And you do have to be, respectful of that. And it's a lot of fun. There are people whom I've met I would never meet because they're not part of my circle of friends, but I've met some really, really smart people. I met this one man who, if you were to look at him, he would look like a thug, but he was Daniel Carmichael. I will never forget him. He was one of the most intelligent people I've ever interviewed. He had just a level of smarts and sense that you can't get from the academy. So, but anyway, and most of society would kind of dismiss him. But it was a pleasure to meet him, and it was a pleasure meeting you.
Right, and I would just say, with the professional, gracious, and grateful, this is a privilege to be able to go into people's intimate spaces and tell their stories, and that is an honor and a privilege, and even when you're interrogating someone, you can still be professional.
Right.
Even when you have to ask hard questions, you can still be diplomatic. You can be gracious and humble in knowing that you can have done all the research, but you still don't know the story. You might know all the facts, but you still might not know the story. And there's that constant tension of art and science, of, hard hitting, but also a sensitivity and humility that is necessary to make it an art. So enjoy, and thank you guys for coming today.
Thank you so much.